Thank you all very, very much. I was thinking, as Carter was speaking, of Pope Benedict when he came to the United States in 2008, and at St. Patrick's Cathedral, he spoke about the great spirit of 19th century Catholicism, the great missionaries, the great priests and religious who built so many of the tremendous institutions in our country, that whole network of charity, education, hospitals. And as Carter was talking, I couldn't help but think that our two great institutions, the University of Notre Dame and the Knights of Columbus, were born of this tremendous spirit, this tremendous missionary spirit that Pope Francis is calling us to time after time. And I think any thinking Catholic who's concerned about his faith and is concerned about the future of our country has to regard the University of Notre Dame as a national treasure. And so for me, to be associated with this as Supreme Knight, to have our oldest college council founded here on the campus of the University of Notre Dame more than 100 years ago, is a source of great pride for us. And so if this medal is a reflection of the solidarity in mission between the University of Notre Dame and the Knights of Columbus, it is a very great honor for us, and we accept it with humility and gratitude. Thank you. On this occasion as well, I cannot help but think of a great friend, a devoted law professor, and a tireless advocate for life, the late Professor Charles E. Rice. And I understand there is a monetary prize that accompanies this award, and I've asked Carter if that could be contributed directly to the Charles E. Rice Fellowship Fund so that it may continue to serve this university and its students that he loves so much. The University of Notre Dame has been a place where 6 presidents of the United States, many governors and senators have spoken, and now you're willing to listen for a time to a Supreme Knight. As Governor Adlai Stevenson used to say, it is now my job to speak and your job to listen, and if you finish before I do, feel free to leave. But I would like to offer some reflections this evening concerning the challenges that we face at the intersection of ethics and culture in working to see that our nation goes forward to embrace a culture of life. The last president of the United States to speak on this campus told the graduating class of 2009 that in a time of increasing diversity, especially diversity of thought, diversity of culture, and diversity of belief, it was incumbent upon us to find a way to live together as one human family. And we could not agree more. He specifically addressed the issue of abortion, and he said that we must work together to, quote, discover at least the possibility of common ground. And one of the ways we could do this, he said, was to, quote, honor the conscience of those who disagree with abortion and draft a sensible conscience clause. That is something he promised we can do. Well, 6 years later, that goal has still not been achieved. And the history of the Department of Health and Human Services contraceptive mandate makes clear why this is so. Since it was announced in August of 2011, the mandate has undergone 7 phases, all of them related to its failure to protect conscience. The original language provided only a very narrow exception for religious organizations, so narrow, in fact, that our nation's bishops observed Jesus and the early Christian church would not qualify. 6 months later, the administration delayed enforcement through a temporary safe harbor provision for religious nonprofit organizations. Then shortly before the 2012 presidential election, the administration expanded the safe harbor to include more nonprofits. Then in February 2013, the administration proposed another change. It removed the provision that exempted only those charities that serve only their own religious members. Thus, it took 18 months to modify the provision that had been objected to by nearly every church and religious organization in the country. At the Knights of Columbus, our objection still remained because the fundamental problem remained. Those who object to paying for abortion-inducing drugs, contraceptives, and sterilization were still required to pay for them, either directly or indirectly, and they were still required to initiate coverage for them. Then last July, the administration announced final regulations that extended the safe harbor period for an additional 6 months while exempting religious nonprofits as long as they would self-certify that they met the exemption criteria. But after losing the Supreme Court cases of Hobby Lobby, Little Sisters of the Poor, and Wheaton College, the administration stated it would revise the mandate again. And so last August, the administration announced its new rule. Organizations eligible for exemption may notify HHS of their objection to the mandate, and the government will then arrange with their insurer to provide coverage at no cost to the organization. Thus, after nearly 4 years of controversy, the administration's goal will be achieved. Contraceptives and abortifacients will be provided by religious employers, notwithstanding their objection. But now the coverage will be provided by means of a subterfuge. Services will be provided at, quote, no cost by government decree. The administration insists that no-cost coverage is possible because preventing births is less expensive than providing for childbirth and infant care. The National Right to Life Committee objected to the administration's plan because, in the future, the same rationale could mandate no-cost coverage of abortion. And now the state of California has done just that, mandated that private employers' health care plans include abortion coverage while denying conscience clause protection to religious organizations. Now, whether the administration or a future one will follow California's lead on the abortion mandate cannot be predicted. As Oliver Wendell Holmes once observed, the life of the law is not logic. But the direction of the administration's logic is clear. The history of the HHS mandate shows an administration grudgingly walking back its proposal only by the smallest steps, and only when ultimately forced to do so by judicial action. And then, in the end, not really walking it back at all. By and large, Catholic organizations have treated the HHS mandate as they would most other regulations. They commented formally during the rulemaking process. They met with administration officials in the hopes of reaching a compromise, and finally they brought legal actions in federal courts. Amazingly, even discussions between the president and bishops Cardinals, the Vatican Secretary of State have apparently made no discernible difference. So I think there is a lesson to be learned here about the future of Catholic institutions in America. Their Catholic identity is now linked with the Affordable Care Act. It is the context in which the HHS mandate exists today and how it will be applied in the future. During a time when the search for common ground and consensus achieved heightened rhetoric in Washington, the Affordable Care Act itself has become an example of the way in which Washington is becoming less democratic and less capable of consensus. As we all know, the act passed Congress on a schedule that denied legislators a realistic opportunity to review its provisions, and many of them admitted never having read the bill and being ignorant of them. The bill's sponsors denied that the legislation was an exercise of the taxing power of Congress. But when its constitutionality was challenged before the Supreme Court, the law was defended precisely on the grounds that it was an exercise of the taxing authority of Congress, and ultimately was upheld on that basis. Mandated contraceptive services for religious entities was not an issue during consideration of the Affordable Care Act. Had it been, the act would never have passed Congress. Admittedly, free market delivery of health care has been less than perfect. We all know that. But whatever its problems, it did one thing very well. It provided something absolutely necessary to the sustainability of Catholic healthcare institutions. It provided freedom. Free markets provided an environment where pluralism and diversity allowed Catholic institutions to define and maintain their own identity. And absent Supreme Court intervention this summer, the Affordable Care Act signals that those days of freedom, whether economic or religious, may be over. Some Catholics have considered this question primarily from the standpoint of whether complying with the mandate constitutes an impermissible material cooperation with evil. But Catholic identity involves considerably more than that. St. Thomas More presents the issue when, in Robert Bolt's play, A Man for All Seasons, he says this about his refusal to take the oath mandated by the Act of Supremacy. He says, "When a man takes an oath, he's holding his own self in his own hands like water. And if he opens his fingers then, he needn't hope to find himself again." Catholic institutions in America today face something similar, and no less devastating to the soul of Catholicism in our nation. The message of the HHS mandate is clear. Catholic institutions may remain free to fashion their own identity as long as that identity conforms to the dictates of government. In the future, we may still choose to speak of Catholic institutions as being counter-cultural and as prophetic. But in what ways do we think that will remain true? One of the important aspects of American exceptionalism is that in America, religion is expected at times to be counter-cultural. But that only really matters when religion can be counter-cultural when it counts. The mutual respect President Obama promised during his commencement address at this university can now be understood through the HHS mandate. As he said on that occasion, no matter how much we may want to fudge it, the fact is that at some level, the views of the two camps, pro-life, pro-choice, are irreconcilable. Perhaps that is all the more reason why the president at the time called for a sensible conscience clause to honor the conscience of those who disagree. And again, we could not agree more. In preparing these remarks, I found myself reflecting on a book by Henry Kissinger, A World Restored. It was Dr. Kissinger's study of the Congress of Vienna and the diplomacy that followed the Napoleonic Wars. Kissinger analyzed what drove Napoleon for almost 20 years to embroil Europe in wars that cost millions of lives. He concluded that Napoleon was in search not of territory, he was in search of legitimacy. As long as there was one kingdom or one country free of his rule, Napoleon considered his legitimacy threatened. Kissinger put it this way: the distinguishing feature of a revolutionary power is not that it feels threatened, but that nothing can reassure it. Only absolute security, the neutralization of the opponent, is considered a sufficient guarantee. And thus the desire of one power for absolute security means absolute insecurity for all the others. And I will presume to add to Dr. Kissinger's hypothesis. It applies as well to the proponents of slavery in the 1850s. Like Napoleon, they too needed constant reinforcement of their legitimacy. And that is why they ultimately concluded, along with Justice Taney, that slavery could not be banned anywhere in the United States. It seems to me that this is helpful in understanding our own situation today. There is a tyrannical impulse within the pro-choice movement to mandate conformity by everyone in America, whether it's through the HHS mandate, state exchanges under the Affordable Care Act that only offer providers that include abortion services, or for example, the DC City Council's recent action in repealing conscience clause protection of Catholic institutions, universities, regarding abortion. Again, if we listen to Dr. Kissinger, he writes, "It is the essence of revolutionary power that it possesses the courage of its convictions, that it is willing, indeed eager, to push its principles to the ultimate conclusion. What drives that impulse, to a large extent, is a deep-seated sense, I believe, of illegitimacy. That is why whenever there's a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court, the pro-choice lobby insists that Roe v. Wade is settled law. But Roe v. Wade can never be settled law because Roe v. Wade is founded upon a falsehood that we do not know a living human being is at stake in the abortion issue. In America, constitutional laws that are founded upon such untruths are, in the long run, simply unsustainable. That is the lesson to be learned from the Supreme Court's shameful decision in the separate but equal segregation case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And such will be the lesson one day of its shameful decision in Roe versus Wade. The Supreme Court may have created a new right in what Justice Byron Wright called an exercise of raw judicial power. But judicial power has not convinced the American people that what the justices did was right. Our Knights of Columbus Marist polling this year shows that 84% of Americans would limit abortion to only the first 3 months of pregnancy. That almost 6 in 10 Americans would limit abortion to only cases of rape and incest and life of the mother. And that includes a majority of Americans who describe themselves as pro-choice. 84% of Americans say our laws can protect both the life of the mother and the life of the child. And almost 2/3 of Americans say that the abortion rate is too high. And 60% say abortion is morally wrong. And the youngest voting Americans hold these same opinions at about the same rate as older Americans. So the Supreme Court has not convinced them either. And so we have reason for hope. In spite of media bias and judicial intransigence, the American people have nonetheless reached a sort of consensus on abortion. And as I suggested several years ago in my book, Beyond a House Divided, there is common ground, and we should seek to build upon it. But today we face a new challenge. With enactment of the Affordable Care Act, government now controls America's health care, approximately 1/6 of the U.S. economy. So we have to ask ourselves, are we entering a time of such government control of the economy that the historic role of what Michael Novak once called mediating structures to influence society may be less and less possible? We should ask ourselves, have we reached a new tipping point? Does the expanding power of government to tax and regulate pose a new threat to the sustainability of our religious institutions? Last month, an article in Foreign Affairs magazine entitled "Dark Days for Civil Society" quotes the president of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. He says, since 2012, more than 90 laws constraining the freedom of association or assembly have been proposed or enacted around the world. The shrinking space for civil society, the article says, is a global problem. Obviously, the problem is most acute in societies with emerging democracies, but it would be naive to assume that this is not also a problem in the established democracies. It would be more accurate to describe the situation this way: dark days for civil society in emerging democracies and shrinking space for civil society in the established democracies. A November report by Europe's Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development suggests just how fast that space is shrinking. It finds that social spending among European nations remains at record levels, an average of 22% of gross domestic product. France leads Europe with 32%. In comparison, the United States spends 19%. But Robert Samuelson, writing in the Washington Post, observes that this is not the most accurate way to observe the situation. He states that when the benefits provided by private corporations, such as health care, are included, the figure in the United States moves from 19% to 30%. Thus, the potential for government control of the U.S. economy through HHS-style mandates goes far beyond what we may have imagined just a few years ago. In Europe, Catholic institutions have found it difficult to resist the steady pressure of governments during the past 4 decades as they dismantled the legal structure on that continent, protecting the sanctity of life, marriage, and the family. Again, Kissinger's analysis is helpful in understanding this revolutionary dynamic and why responses to it have been inadequate. He writes, "The defenders of the status quo begin by treating the revolutionary power as if its demands were merely tactical as if it really accepted the existing legitimacy of the status quo and can be assuaged by limited concessions. Those who warn against the danger in time are considered alarmists. Those who counsel adaptation to circumstance, moderation, are considered balanced and sane, for they have all the good reasons on their side. The inevitable failure of the balanced, tactical approach results, Kissinger observes, from its inability to come to grips with a policy of unlimited objectives. And so has been the recent history of family law in Europe. It would be unrealistic to think that this revolutionary pressure has had no effect on the catastrophic collapse of Christianity on that continent during our lifetime, a collapse that necessitated the repeated calls by St. John Paul II for a new evangelization. He realized that the problem we face is more than political. It is ideological, it is philosophical, and therefore an adequate response must be more than tactical. In the United States and Europe, in fact, throughout the declining West, persons of faith confront an ideology today based on a false concept of personhood. Because this ideology does not understand the human person, it understands neither men nor women. It makes all of them, makes all of us, isolated beings, disconnected, living for ourselves. It purports to take us back to the Garden of Eden. In reality, it leaves each of us stranded in our own Sahara of the Spirit. This has led to a perverse form of personal freedom, which in turn has led to a perverse forms of personal liberation. One in particular is the liberation of men from the responsibilities of fatherhood. There is a reason why most public opinion polls over the years have shown greater support by men for abortion than by women. So now our country faces the emergence of a new normal: children without a father in the house. What does this have to do with the HHS mandate? Everything. The mandate rests upon the myth that women's social and economic equality depends upon universal availability of contraception, sterilization, and abortion, imposed by, if necessary, by government. That myth is foundational to a political ideology that has been ascendant for some time in Europe and more recently in various degrees throughout the United States. But that myth also provides for something more: the justification or the cover for all the afflictions consequent upon the sexual revolution. In this light, the HHS mandate is not necessary to protect women's rights, but it is necessary to further secure the emancipation of men from the responsibilities of fatherhood. It does this by maintaining a socio-cultural status quo in which the deck is stacked against both women and children. It is rooted in an ideology divorced from the real needs of American women and alien to the needs of America's children. Historically, the first principles of any ideology are non-negotiable. That is why the HHS mandate cannot be compromised. Napoleon could not accept a multipolar Europe, and the White House is not likely to back off of its mandate. So we must ask ourselves, how is it possible to preserve the liberty of our institutions when the authentic freedom of individuals is so badly misunderstood? Of course, we hope that the Supreme Court will uphold our free exercise of religion with regard to the HHS mandate. Religious institutions cannot be allowed to become either the political or the policy servants of the state. And here we are all grateful to the leadership that the University of Notre Dame has provided in its own litigation on this issue. But even if successful, litigation is only part of the answer. The observation of Yale Law professor Stephen Carter on this point is important. He writes, in The Culture of Disbelief, at times, the Supreme Court has been the great protector of autonomy of religions as faith communities. But American society should not depend on its courts as the sole or even the most important protector of religious autonomy. Judicial authority extends to the bounds, but not beyond, of the Constitution. The nation's need for autonomous religion stands outside of that document. It is a need that flows from the nature of democracy as a form of government. To try to make the religions in their internal organization conform to the state's vision of properly ordered society is not simply a corruption of the constitutional tradition of religious freedom. It is also an assault on the autonomy of religions as bulwarks against state authority. And so how are we to engage this issue, as Professor Carter suggests, that is beyond the bounds of the Constitution? This brings us to the mission of the Center for Ethics and Culture, and its belief that the truth the Church affirms about the human person is the foundation for freedom, justice, human dignity, and the common good. If we take this as our starting point, then the recent address of Pope Francis to the European Parliament should be our roadmap, because it does not bother with merely tactical suggestions. Instead, he gives us something more fundamental and something more enduring. In his address, the Holy Father asserts that at the heart of Europe's democratic institutions is the confidence that men and women are persons endowed with transcendent dignity, and that this dignity requires government to recognize that each of us possesses inalienable rights. The Pope then says this: to speak of transcendent human dignity thus means appealing to human nature, to our innate capacity to distinguish good from evil, to that compass deep within our hearts which God has impressed upon all creation. Above all, he continued, it means regarding human beings not as absolutes, but as beings in relation. And toward the end of his address, he calls upon Europe to appreciate its religious roots and tells them that these roots are still capable of fruitfulness. With these principles, Pope Francis has pointed out a constellation, a North Star, if you will, to guide our future path. In going forward, let us remember the wisdom of the Second Vatican Council, that authentic freedom is an exceptional sign of the divine image within man. Early in these remarks, I quoted the last president to have spoken on this campus. Permit me to close by quoting the first president to have done so. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said this on this campus: there can be no true national life unless there be specific acknowledgement of the rights of man. And supreme among these rights, we hold to be freedom of religious worship. He then went on to observe, George Mason, in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, voiced what has become one of the deepest convictions of the American people. Religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conscience, not by force or violence. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. So said Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The foundations of our nation, those men and women who pledged their lives and their sacred honor to the cause of liberty in Philadelphia, whether deist or Catholic, Baptist or Anglican, all would have agreed with us that freedom is an exceptional sign of the divine image within man. If there is a core to the American understanding of freedom as a principle that can be neither negotiated nor compromised away, it is this recognition that freedom is a reflection of the divine image in every human being. The time has come for bold action. It is a time for Catholics to take up a new evangelization of the American concept of freedom. And this year, on the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae, this year is a good time for us to begin. In doing this, we will affirm what is fundamental to the American character. Pope Francis, in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelium Gaudium, calls for a new missionary spirit among Catholics. The great Catholic institutions of our country were built by men and women filled with this great missionary spirit. They seized an opportunity offered only by our nation's commitment to the free exercise of religion. And with that opportunity, they constructed an unprecedented, great network of institutions for Catholics and non-Catholics alike. These institutions were not intended to simply fill a gap left by the limitation of government. They were not, as Pope Francis has told us, simply NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Their mission was greater. These institutions opened a window on the transcendent dignity of each human being, and especially those whose dignity government neglected. And these institutions offered something else that government cannot offer. They offered Evangelium Vitae, the gospel of life. This was not a promise spoken about only on Sunday morning in houses of worship. It was a promise lived out in the hard realities of the day-to-day life of the poor and the suffering. You and I are called not only to sustain these great institutions, you and I are called to sustain this great promise. We must preserve the free exercise of religion in our country, which allows us not only to make this promise in the United States, but to keep this promise. The autonomy of our religious institutions is not extrinsic to the missionary nature of Christianity. Rather, it is essential to it. We must be missionaries of the gospel of life. And today, this means we must be missionaries of authentic freedom. Thank you very much for your patience.
That's not nonsense.